Okay, so I better get started. So welcome back, everyone. So in the last few lectures of the course, we focused on perception and looked at how our brain is taking in signals from our eyes and our ears and so on, and then processing those signals in a way that generates our perception of the world around us. This week and next week, we're going to focus on emotion and then memory. And so these are cognitive processes that add meaning to what we experience. And so the things that we see around us can have emotional weight to us. They can make us happy and excited or sad and depressed. And then things also have meaning to us because of our past experiences, our memory. One thing that we will look at is the experience of two people who lost these basic capabilities for memory and emotion. And so on the left here is a man named Henry Molaison, or patient HM. He's known as in the literature. And some of you may have heard of his story. So he had a brain surgery when he was in his 20s that removed a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And following this surgery, he lost the ability to form long-term episodic memories. And so he ended up living most of his life more in the moment than the rest of us, unable to form any kind of lasting impression of the things that happened to him, from the age of 27 when he had the surgery until the age of 82 when he died. On the right is a cheerful drawing by a woman who's known in the literature as patient SM, and she suffered damage to a different part of her brain called the amygdala, and this caused her to lose the ability to experience fear. And so later in today's lecture, we'll look a bit more at her life to gain some insight into what it will be like to live without fear. So today we're focusing on emotion. I'll try to say something about how we define what emotion is and what the functions of emotion are. I'll then talk about what happens in our brain when we experience emotions, and at the end I'll talk briefly about anxiety and how medications that influence the symptoms of anxiety are affecting the function of the brain. So by the end of the lecture, you should be able to discuss the role of bodily responses in the experience of emotion, explain how the amygdala has been implicated in emotion, and describe physiological processes that underlie pharmacological treatments for anxiety. Okay, so emotion isn't always straightforward to define as a concept. And one way of illustrating this is to consider what kind of creatures we think experience emotions. And so I think all of us would agree that this baby is experiencing an emotion. He looks really upset. I also think most of us would agree that this cat here is experiencing an emotion. But then perhaps a more controversial case is whether these bees are experiencing an emotion. And so the bees here are displaying or acting in a way that is consistent with anger or aggression by swarming and biting this guy who's meddling with their hive. But whether these bees are actually experiencing a sense of anger is something that we can't directly observe, right? And so in each of these cases, there is a behavior that's consistent with an emotional reaction, but that isn't necessarily enough for us to say that a real kind of emotional reaction is taking place. In general, psychologists agree that there are different components that make up emotion, including cognitive evaluation, subjective feelings, autonomic arousal, and impulses to action. A cognitive evaluation might be the thought that we're currently in a dangerous situation. That might make us feel afraid. That feeling of fear might be accompanied by changes in the physiological state of our body, like an increase in our heart rate, for example. And then all of this might then motivate us to run for the nearest exit. So these are different components of the emotion of fear. One complexity here is that these different components can happen at least partly independent of each other. So there may be situations where we have a sense of anxiety or feel kind of nervous. We notice changes in our body, like our heart is racing, but we might not really be sure why this is happening, and it might not really motivate us to any particular action. We might also have cognitive evaluations that are consistent with an emotional reaction and which motivate us to particular actions in some situations, like the thought that COVID is dangerous motivates us to get another booster shot. But this might happen without any kind of subjective feeling of anxiety or fear, and without any kind of obvious physiological change in our body. Another complexity is that there are other psychological states that we usually don't think of as being emotions that also involve many of these same kind of components. And so hunger, for example, is associated with a particular subjective feeling. It can be accompanied by physiological changes in our body, like our stomach grumbling. And it, of course, motivates us towards particular actions. But we usually don't think of hunger as being an emotional state in quite the same way that happiness and sadness are, for example. And so the point here is firstly that emotions are multifaceted. They're made up of different components that we can define, but also that there's some ambiguity or grey area here in exactly how we draw the line between emotions and other kinds of psychological states that we experience. Okay, so these autonomic reactions are an important component of emotion. And in the lecture on anatomy, we saw that a part of our nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, which is this network of nerves that extend out of our spinal cord and our brain and come in contact with the different organs of our body. And this allows our brain, like our brainstem, for example, to play a role in controlling the activity of our organs. We made a distinction between the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares our body for fight or flight, so increasing blood flow to our muscles, increasing the beating of our heart, our rate of breathing, and so on, while at the same time down-regulating the activity of organs that are less essential in that moment, like our digestive system. While on the other hand, we have the parasympathetic nervous system that has the opposite role of preparing our body for resting and digesting. Autonomic responses often occur as part of our emotional reactions to things that happen around us. So, for example, our heart tends to beat faster when we're excited, anxious, or afraid. And there are some theories of emotion that really emphasize the role of these physiological changes in our body in producing our subjective experience of emotion. And so the idea being that the feeling of fear is closely related to the sense of a kind of tenseness in our muscles. The feeling of sadness is closely related to the kind of constriction we feel in our chest and our throat when we're upset. So the idea here is that there are events in our environment that trigger physiological changes in our body, like increase our heart rate, increase the tenseness of our muscles, and our subjective experience of emotion is really a kind of interpretation or a perception of those changes that have happened in our body. So this kind of idea is often attributed to William James and referred to as the James Lange theory of emotion. There are also some kind of more recent theories that build on this idea that have different names. And I think there's at least something quite intuitive about the idea. There's something that seems at least partly right about it, that I think all of us have had the experience of like feeling kind of stressed out at the end of a long day, coming home and then doing something that relaxes the state of our body, like going for a swim or getting a massage or something like that. And just calming down the state of our body can then make us feel better, even though the situation that was stressing us out hasn't actually changed. Whether these autonomic responses are actually necessary, however, to produce a subjective feeling of emotion is more ambiguous. There's kind of mixed evidence for that. One example is related to a condition called pure autonomic failure, which is where a person's autonomic nervous system ceases working correctly. And people with this condition, their organs continue to work, like their heart still beats, but it's not controlled or regulated from moment to moment in the same way by the brain. And so their heart rate is less likely to kind of change in response to things that are happening around them in the environment. And people with this condition often report having emotions, like they'll say, sometimes I'm sad, sometimes I'm happy, but also that they are experiencing those emotions less intensely than they did before the condition developed. Another example is studies that have looked at people who have suffered damage to an area of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this region of the brain has a role in regulating as well these autonomic responses in our body. And as an example, what one study did is they, first of all, played kind of emotional pieces of music to people. So these were film soundtracks that, as you know, are often kind of sort of designed to like tug on our heartstrings or be really uplifting and things like that. And they found that when people listened to these film soundtracks, often their sort of body responded. There were changes in things like, it could be their heart rate, it could be something called skin conductance, which is a measure of how much they're sweating. But they found in people with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, there was less of a autonomic response when listening to these emotional pieces of music, but they could still identify the emotion associated with the music. They could still say that this is a sad piece of music, this is a happy one, and they still rated the intensity of the emotion as strongly as controls. So providing some kind of evidence that these autonomic responses in our body are not necessary to produce a feeling of emotion, at least in these people who have suffered damage to their brain. Another kind of related idea about emotion is that it relates to a perception of our body's actions, that this also contributes to our feelings. So one key version of this theory is something called the facial feedback hypothesis, which is the idea that the emotional feelings are either derived from or at least kind of amplified by a perception of our own facial expressions. So to illustrate what I mean by that, this image is from a study where they got people to read cartoons, and in one condition they kind of forced people to smile by asking them to hold a pen in between their teeth, which kind of forces their mouth into something resembling a smile. In another condition, they asked people to hold the pen in between their lips, which then prevents them from being able to smile properly. And what they found is that people forced to smile then kind of rated the cartoons as being funnier than people who were forced not to smile. And so suggesting that just the kind of act of smiling may be enough to kind of amplify the sort of feelings of happiness that we have. Another kind of interesting line of research related to this looks at what happens when muscles of the face are paralyzed. And so, including in people who have had Botox injections in their forehead. And so Botox is as you probably know, is a kind of toxin that can paralyze muscles. And it's one of the most common cosmetic procedures worldwide is to have Botox injected into certain muscles in the forehead to paralyze them. And what's been and so these particular muscles are involved in sort of narrowing our eyes. Like if we're looking at a bright light and we're sort of squinting, or we're concentrating, or we're frowning, these kind of movements of our eyes and our forehead are what these muscles are responsible for. And so when they're paralyzed, it means that the person can't kind of frown in the same way as they could before. And what's interesting is that it's been found, or at least there's some evidence, that this then affects the way that a person interprets the emotions of others and perhaps feels emotions themselves. And so, for example, there's some research finding that people who have had these Botox injections in their forehead are not only a bit more limited in how they express emotions with their face, but it can also lead to improvements in symptoms of depression. And so the idea here, in line with the face feedback hypothesis, is that being less able to frown, to kind of express that type of emotion with your face, then makes it harder for you to kind of feel that emotion or sort of stay in that kind of emotional state. You can probably think of some other ways of interpreting that kind of finding. So it might be that if you're happy with the procedure, you feel better about your appearance, and that also might affect your symptoms of depression. If you're frowning less, then maybe other people treat you differently, and that also makes you happier. And so this paper that's linked here discusses some of those different ways of interpreting that finding. Okay, so emotions we can lump into different categories, like happy, sad, angry, and so on. But we can also define them in a dimensional way. And so two key dimensions that are used to distinguish between different emotions are called valence and arousal. Valence refers to how positive or negative the emotional state is. So happy, excited, relaxed, or positive valence states. Angry, sad, negative valence states. While arousal refers to how kind of stimulated or energetic or agitated a person is. And so angry and excited differ in their valence, but they're both sort of high energy states, high valence states, high arousal states. And then sad and relaxed are both sort of low arousal states. Another way of categorizing emotions is in terms of how we express them. And so our face contains a number of distinct muscles that produce particular changes in the appearance of our face. So like widening of the eyes, lowering of the brow, sort of raising of the cheek, furrowing of the nose or the brow. And so we can define different emotions partly in terms of the particular pattern of face actions that are associated with that emotion. The way we perceive emotions in other people is, of course, partly based off their face expression. It also depends on the broader context as well. So this is Roger Federer, and kind of looking just at his face here, it might be slightly ambiguous whether what emotion he's feeling. It's clearly high arousal state, but is he really happy or is he really upset? When you see the full picture, including the posture of his body, the reaction of the crowd behind him, and so on, it should become a bit clearer that this is what Federer looks like when he's really happy. Okay, so the key learning points here are that emotions have different components. I think when we think of emotion, we usually think of the subjective feeling, but they also are associated with particular kinds of cognitive evaluations, changes in the physiological state of our body, and particular kinds of actions. And we've looked at how some theories of emotion cast the subjective feeling of emotion as a kind of interpretation or perception of these autonomic changes happening in our body during an emotional reaction, or particular kinds of muscular activation, like particular facial expressions. Okay, so now we can talk a little bit about what emotions are for. And so generally, the reason that we have a capacity to feel emotions and the reason that we respond to things in an emotional way is because we've evolved in this way to have this capacity, and because it's something that has helped our species to survive and reproduce. One function of emotions is to help guide our decision making, and this has often been studied in the context of moral dilemmas. So a classic moral dilemma that's illustrated here is called the trolley problem. And in this hypothetical scenario here, you're asked to imagine that there's a runaway train carriage hurtling down the tracks, out of control, nobody's at the wheel. Somebody nefarious has tied up a group of 5 people and put them on the train tracks. And the train is hurtling towards them, but luckily you're standing next to a lever. So you're this guy with a yellow shirt here. And if you pull the lever, it will divert the track that the train is on and save those 5 people. But unfortunately, there's one other person tied up on that side of the tracks. And so pulling the lever will lead to that person dying. And so the question here is, what do you do? Will you pull the lever to switch the track, saving those 5 people but killing another person, or will you do nothing and just allow those 5 people to die? So you can make your decision and put it in through Poll Everywhere. Okay, so time's up. So split, fairly evenly, with a few more people, maybe 60-40, in favour of pulling the lever and killing that one person, but saving the 5. We can now consider a slightly different situation where, again, there's a train hurtling down the tracks out of control. There's 5 people tied up on the tracks who are about to be run over. This time, you're on a footbridge over the tracks. You're there together with a large man, and you realise if I push this large man off the footbridge, he'll be crushed by the train, but his body will slow down the train enough that it will save those 5 people. So the question now is, do you do nothing, allow those 5 people to die, or do you push the man off and halt the train? Okay, and so this time people seem much more reluctant to act in this situation. So it's like 80% are saying that they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. They're going to just let these 5 people get run over. Okay, and then a final situation is, now you're in another sticky situation. You're on a life raft in the middle of the ocean in icy waters. You're together with 5 other people, but unfortunately this life raft can only has a capacity of 5 in total. Okay, and it's starting to fill with water, it's sinking. If you don't do anything, you're all going to die. You realise if you just push off one of these people, they'll probably drown in these icy waters, but the rest of you will survive. So what do? Do you push someone off the life raft, or do you just allow everyone to drown? Okay, so again, there's a bit of a split, but more people leaning towards not doing anything and allowing everyone to drown in this situation. Okay, so in each of these three scenarios, the actual outcomes at stake are pretty much the same. So it's either you do nothing, allow 5 people to die, or you act and save those 5 people but kill 1 person in the process. Generally, the way that people say they would act when confronted with these kind of moral dilemmas matches what the class shows on average here, that people are generally inclined to pull the lever in this first situation to save the 5 people, even though it will lead to 1 person dying who would otherwise survive. But they're more reluctant to say that they would act in these other situations, even though the outcome is the same, of killing 1 person to save a group of other people. So there's something that we just don't like about the idea of, actively pushing someone to their death. There's something that feels more personal about it, and more kind of emotionally bothersome about it. It's been found that when people contemplate these kind of moral dilemmas, there can be sort of physiological reactions in their body, like changes in their heart rate and things like that, an increase in autonomic arousal. And it's been found that people who experience a greater kind of physiological reaction to contemplating these types of decisions are also less likely to choose the action of pushing the guy off in order to save a group of other people. So consistent with the idea that it's partly our sort of emotional response to this situation that is shaping a part of our decision. It's also been found that people who have suffered damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, who show less kind of autonomic responses to contemplating these kind of dilemmas, and are also more likely to choose the option that involves killing someone but saving a greater number of lives. And so utilitarian here just means maximizing the outcomes. So like the ends justifies the means. It's better to save 5 lives, even if that means killing someone in the process. Traditionally, people often can sort of draw attention between reason and emotion. So like the idea that in order to kind of make good decisions, rational decisions, we need to sort of suppress our emotions or control our emotions is one sort of common way of looking at things. And so in these types of dilemmas, it might be tempting to think it'll be better if we could just, suppress our reluctance to act in these situations and just act and save the 5 lives. You may or may not agree with that. But in general, the reason that we have emotions, that our species has emotions, is because they've been useful. They've helped us to survive and reproduce. And so that includes helping us to make better decisions that are better for us. And so in terms of defining the actual usefulness of particular emotions, sometimes this is fairly obvious, that like fear is something that motivates us to escape from an immediate danger. Anxiety is something that can help us prepare for and avoid possible future dangers that we can imagine. Disgust can motivate us to avoid eating foods that might make us ill. For other emotions, it can be a bit more difficult to define or to define what the value of them are. So like sadness, for example, often doesn't feel very helpful. It can feel kind of counterproductive sometimes. With sadness, one idea is that its function is to signal to other people around us that we need help. And so classic example of that is a baby crying signals to its parents that it needs attention from them. And people who have a diminished capacity for emotions, which can sometimes occur following damage to the brain, can also sometimes make bad decisions, like risky decisions, and come to harm as a result. And so we'll come back to this idea in the second half of the lecture when we talk about patient SM. Okay, so the key points here are that we've evolved the capacity to experience and express emotions because it's useful. One function of emotion is to help guide decision making. And in the tutorial that ran over the past fortnight, you looked in a bit more detail at how we can think of anxiety as a useful emotion, and how that can contribute to our perspective to some degree about anxiety disorders. Okay. All right, so before we have a break, let's do a poll everywhere question. So the question here is to imagine that you're chucking out the rubbish one evening. You open the rubbish chute in your department building and you find a live snake inside. As you run away screaming, you notice that your body has gone into fight or flight mode with an increased rate of breathing and blood flow to your muscles. What would the James Lange theory of emotion say about these physiological responses? Would it say that your feeling of fear towards the snake triggered these physiological responses in order to prepare your body for action in a dangerous situation? Would it say that your feeling of fear towards the snake is an interpretation of these physiological responses to your environment? That these physiological responses are typically a maladaptive or unhelpful aspect of emotion? Or that these physiological responses are unimportant for guiding action and decision making? Okay, so looks like most people have put an answer in already, and pretty much everyone is going for B, which is meant to be the correct answer. So the idea with this James Lange theory is to kind of reframe a little bit the relationship between the changes in our body that happen during emotional reactions and the subjective feeling of an emotion. The idea is that those changes in our body are actually triggered first by things happening in our environment, like increases in our heart rate, and then our feeling of fear is a kind of perception or interpretation of those changes happening in our body. So A, what it's saying is correct, that these physiological responses, like increased heart rate, their purpose is to prepare our body for action, to provide more energy to our muscles when they need it. But this isn't the sort of focus of the James Lange theory of emotion. Okay, so let's have a 10-minute break and come back about 10 minutes to 3. Thanks. Okay, so I better get started again. So now we can look a bit at what is happening in our brain when we experience emotions. And there have been many studies that have used techniques like fMRI and PET to measure changes in activation that are happening in the brain while a person is experiencing some kind of emotional reaction. The image here is summarizing the results of a number of different studies, and how many of these studies work is they will ask someone to lie in the fMRI scanner, recording their brain activity, while showing them either kind of pictures or reading them stories that are designed to elicit some kind of emotional reaction, like make the person feel disgusted or angry and so on. These different dots here represent different parts of the brain where changes in activation have been observed when people are having some kind of emotional reaction, so the colours corresponding to different types of emotional states. And you can see here that there's this quite widespread activation across the brain associated with emotion. So there isn't any one kind of single emotion centre of the brain. Rather, emotional reactions can involve activation across different parts of our cortex and in different subcortical areas as well. particular network of areas that has been traditionally linked closely to emotion is called the limbic system, which is illustrated here. So this is a group of different areas that are kind of on the interior of our brain, clustered around the thalamus, which is shown in yellow here. And it includes a structure called the hippocampus, which is involved in the formation of long-term memories, and we'll focus on the hippocampus next week. It also includes this structure, the amygdala, which is highlighted here, and which we're going to focus on a bit more now. This is another view of the amygdala. So in this coronal section of the brain, for example, it's this lump of grey matter highlighted here, found kind of deep in the temporal lobes in both hemispheres of the brain. And the amygdala seems to have this specific role in producing our feelings of fear and our ability to learn to fear things in our environment. And so first of all, it receives information about what's happening around us in the environment through connections that it shares with the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and the thalamus. And then it sends out signals to modulate activity in the cortex to help control behavior, and it's also able to modulate signals that are being sent down from the brain through the spinal cord to affect the function of our body, like the tension of our muscles and autonomic functions like our heart rate and our breathing. And so these are components of our typical fear response. So often when we're like suddenly frightened, there's like a sudden slamming noise behind us as the door flies shut in the wind, and we get a fright. Often the way we react is to sort of tense up our muscles, and our heart rate starts increasing and things like that. And so the amygdala overall has this role in detecting threats in our environment, loud noises and things like that, and mediating the immediate bodily response to those threats. The role of the amygdala in fear reactions has been studied partly in rats, and this is one example of how they try to induce a fear reaction in a rat. So in this study, in this video, the rats here, we have a food pellet here that's attracting the rat, and the thing on the right is a kind of like robot predator that's going to kind of lunge at the rat. Okay, so the rat approaches the food, this kind of robot predator kind of rudely lunges at it, and the rat gets a fright and runs back to safety. Here's another view of that here. Okay, so you'll notice that the rat first kind of freezes up, and when the predator lunges at it, and then it sort of runs away back to safety. That's a normal fear response. In rats that have suffered damage to the amygdala, they tend to react differently, which is illustrated in this video. Okay, so here the rat with damage to its amygdala, the robot thing is lunging at it, and it just sort of seems to ignore it, calmly fetches the food and goes back to its house. Related to this, there's this quite fascinating interaction that occurs between species that has been described, where a particular parasite called Toxoplasma gondii seems to have evolved to exploit the consequences of damage to the amygdala in rats. And so this is a parasite that can infect different mammal species, but shares a special relationship with cats, where it's able to reproduce inside the body of a cat. The eggs of the parasite are expelled in the feces of cats that have been infected, and then they're able to find their way to other animals, including rats, that sort of ground-dwelling animals, And the kind of amazing part is that this parasite in rats seems to migrate to the brain and influence the behavior of a rat in a way that makes it less fearful of cats. And so rats that are less fearful of cats are then more likely to get eaten, and in that way the parasite finds its way back to the body of the cat and completes its life cycle. So this idea comes partly from studies that have assessed the behavior of rats when they've been infected with this parasite. And so one way that rats typically behave is that they tend to avoid areas that smell like cats as one of their kind of natural predators. Some studies have then compared rats that are infected with the parasite to those that are not in their behavior, and found that infected rats tend not to show that avoidance of areas that smell like a cat. They're happy to visit those areas. And then along with that, we know that the amygdala is involved in the rat's kind of typical fear response from studies like we saw on the previous slide. And it's also been found that in rats that are infected with this parasite, the parasite is able to migrate to the brain, and there can be molecular changes happening in the neurons in the amygdala that alter the way that those neurons respond when the rat is exposed to the scent of a cat. And so it's some evidence that this parasite is actually changing the function of the brain in rats in a way that reduces this natural kind of fear response. So enough about rats. What about humans? The amygdala also seems to be important to the experience of fear in humans. And one really interesting line of research in this regard is that focuses on people who have suffered damage to the amygdala and looked at what their behavior and their experience is like. And a key example of this is the woman that I mentioned earlier, patient SM, and she's described in this video.
SM is one of the most famous case studies in all of affective neuroscience. She's a woman who is currently, I think, in her 40s. And as far as we can tell, the destruction of her amygdala has left her essentially fearless to at least external stimuli. And to test whether SM is in fact fearless, the researchers who worked with her took her to a couple of the most frightening places that they could think of in the local area. So one was an exotic pet store, and they offered her exotic snakes to hold in the store, even though she says she's afraid of snakes. Many people would hesitate to hold a snake right up to their face and touch its tongue and inspect its face really closely, but SM had no problem doing that. And so what was really interesting about this is that SM is not emotionless. She experienced a lot of curiosity and excitement, which we think are governed by other regions of the brain predominantly. But she just doesn't seem to have any normal anticipatory fear response. But her lack of a fear response gets her in trouble. So she apparently walks home in the evenings through sort of a vacant lot, and she was mugged there at one point, and I think at knife point. And most people, when something scary like that happens to you and you are at risk of getting hurt, you have a normal fear response when you're approaching that same place that would send you avoiding it. I mean, that's what the fear response is all about, avoid things that might hurt you. And she doesn't have that response, so she continues to take that same route home every night by herself.
Okay, so this kind of localized damage to the amygdala in SM's brain is visualized here. So on the right here is a structural MRI scan of her brain, and you can see these dark areas here are where the amygdala kind of ought to be, where the tissue is missing. The reason this damage came about is due to a rare genetic condition that leads to calcium accumulating in the temporal lobes, and that accumulation of calcium can kind of damage and kill off the sort of soft tissue of the brain. The study that was mentioned in that video is quite interesting, and so I'll sort of tell you a few more details about that now. And so this was a study where they tried to understand more about her experience by taking her to places that would usually provoke a fear response, an exotic pet store with snakes and spiders, a haunted house, and they also made her watch some horror films. This is a quote from the paper that they say that SM displayed a compulsive desire to want to touch and poke the larger and more dangerous snakes, even though the store employee repeatedly told her that the snakes were not safe and could bite. In total, she asked 15 times whether she could touch one of the larger snakes. She also attempted to touch a tarantula but had to be stopped because of the high risk of being bitten. They took her to this haunted house on Halloween, a place called the Waverly Hill Sanatorium, which apparently on Halloween they have kind of guided tours where they arrange people to dress up as sort of ghosts and monsters and kind of scare the people on the tour. So this place is ranked as one of the most haunted places in the world. From the outset, SM voluntarily led the entire group through the haunted house, showing no signs of hesitation while walking around corners or into dark hallways. As the other members of the group lagged behind her, she would repeatedly call out, "This way, guys, follow me." The hidden monsters attempted to scare SM numerous times, but to no avail. She reacted by smiling, laughing, or trying to talk to them. And then I thought interesting part of the study was where they made her watch a whole bunch of kind of scary movies like The Ring, The Blair Witch Project, and so on. And then they asked her to rate sort of how scary these movies were. In these light grey bars here, these represent the ratings of a group of healthy controls, and the scale here is going from sort of not scary at all to extremely scary. And you can see that for like particular scenes from the Ring, it's people are rating it as like extreme fear. In SM's case, she seemed kind of unbothered by these movies. She didn't rate them as being frightening at all. And that difference seemed to be specific to the experience of fear. And so when they showed her film clips from other movies that had been selected to evoke different types of emotions, like really sad scenes, scenes that tend to sort of make people happy or disgusted or angry and so on, SM rated her experience of these emotions when watching those scenes as being kind of equivalent pretty much to what healthy controls did. So it seemed to be a specific difference in her experience of fear. This kind of state of not experiencing fear, sounds like it would be quite nice in sort of many situations. But of course, the reason that most of us have a fear response is because it can be useful. It's something that we've evolved because it's benefited our species over time. And unfortunately, SM has been the victim of violence a number of times. They describe in the paper that she's been held up at knife point and at gunpoint. She was once physically accosted by a woman twice her size. She was nearly killed in an act of domestic violence. And on more than one occasion, she's been explicitly threatened with death. And so anyone can be a victim of violence, but it's not hard to imagine that lacking any kind of fear response might put you in situations where you're at greater risk. Okay, so as well as being involved in mediating our fear response, our kind of sense of fear and the changes in kind of bodily reactions that accompany that, the amygdala is also involved in our ability to perceive or detect fear in other people. As an example of that, in one study, what they did is they isolated a very simple cue to fear. So we express fear partly with a particular facial expression, and that tends to include kind of widening our eyes that exposes the whites of our eyes. So this is quite a salient cue to fear on another person's face, the widening of the eyes. In this study, they show people these kind of images that are just isolating that kind of exposure of the whites of the eyes. So this is associated with a fearful expression on the left or a happy expression on the right. And they found that just that kind of minimal cue to fear in another person's face is enough to produce a response in a person's amygdala, which they were measuring with fMRI in this example. SM, who has suffered damage to her amygdala, also seems to have some difficulty in picking up on fear in other people as well. And kind of related to this, one study that I thought was interesting was one where they asked her to draw people with different kinds of emotional reactions, and you can see that she does quite a good job for drawing like a happy expression, a sad expression, an angry, this guy looks really angry. But when she gets to fear, she kind of draws this sort of strange baby with its hair standing on end. And so, kind of suggesting maybe that she's having difficulty even imagining what a sort of fearful face looks like. Okay, so the key points here are that the amygdala plays a role in our experience of fear through its interconnection with other areas of our brain. Damage to the amygdala can lead to a decreased fear response both in rats and in humans as well. And the amygdala also responds to emotional stimuli, such as when we're looking at a fearful expression on another person's face. Okay, so to finish up, I'm going to talk briefly about anxiety and biological interventions for anxiety. And so anxiety is a normal emotion that has adaptive value by helping us to avoid and prepare for potential dangers in our environment. If you feel a bit anxious about your final exams, that might be a good thing if it's kind of motivating you to prepare more in advance for those exams. What we consider to be a kind of normal level of anxiety really depends on the context that a person is in. So if you live in a war zone, then feeling extreme anxiety every day might be appropriate for your circumstances. But that same level of anxiety experienced if you live in sort of a relatively safe place like Singapore might be considered a sign of an anxiety disorder. And so what we consider to be a anxiety disorder is typically when anxiety is at a level that is unhelpful for the person and excessive for their circumstances. There are many things that can help to cope with anxiety. Here I'm just going to focus briefly on pharmacological interventions. So a common class of drugs that is prescribed to help someone deal with symptoms of anxiety are benzodiazepines. So these are what are referred to as anxiolytic drugs, just meaning that they reduce the experience of anxiety. Diazepam is one type of benzodiazepine and has been, you might be familiar with it, it's been marketed as Valium in some countries. And the way that these drugs work seems to be by interacting with GABA receptors in a person's brain. And so we looked a bit at GABA receptors earlier in the course. So GABA is this inhibitory neurotransmitter in our brain that has a particular role in helping or allowing our neurons to inhibit the activity of other neurons. GABA is released from the axon terminal of a neuron. It goes into the synaptic cleft, which is this blue part here, and then it's able to bind to the outer surface of the GABA receptor, which is embedded in the postsynaptic membrane of a neuron on the other side of the synapse. And when GABA binds to the GABA receptor, it causes an ion channel in the receptor to open that allows chloride ions that are in the synaptic cleft to enter the postsynaptic neuron. And because those chloride ions are negatively charged, they make the postsynaptic neuron more negative inside. They hyperpolarize the neuron, and that has the effect of making it less likely that the neuron will be able to produce an action potential. So in that way, GABA is inhibiting the activity of the neuron. Benzodiazepines are also able to bind to the GABA receptor at the synapse. They bind to a different site of the receptor, which is illustrated here. And when they bind to it, they don't actually have the same effect of GABA. They don't directly open the receptor in the way that GABA does, but instead they cause a structural change in the receptor that makes it easier or more likely for GABA to bind to the receptor. So they're facilitating the effects of GABA by in this slightly kind of indirect route. Okay, but the effect of that is that when GABA is released into the synapse, it's easier for it to bind to the receptor, and that leads to greater opening of ion channels, greater frequency of opening, and a greater inhibition of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so these benzodiazepines, they facilitate inhibition in our brain, including in regions like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the midbrain, and other areas. We know that the effect of these drugs on inhibition of neurons in these parts of the brain are important because in rats, if we directly inject benzodiazepines into the amygdala, for example, it's been found to reduce anxiety-like behaviors in the rats. And in humans, these drugs have been prescribed for many decades now as a treatment for anxiety. They tend to be controlled medications available with a prescription because they're often thought to carry a risk of addiction and overdose. Okay, another drug that's more widely available and can interact with anxiety is alcohol. Interestingly, alcohol also seems to facilitate inhibition in our brain by binding to, again, a special site that's found on certain GABA receptors in our brain. And so alcohol is generally described as having a depressant effect on the brain that can lead to reduced experience of anxiety. It can also have other effects, of course, like impairing our motor coordination. On the right is an image that I showed earlier in the course when talking about the synapse. And so this is sort of illustrating a study where they fed a group of rats alcohol. In some of the rats, like the one on the right, they also injected the rat with a drug that blocks the ability of alcohol to bind to GABA receptors in the rat's brain. And they found that this led to alcohol having less of an effect on the rat's behavior. Okay, so the key kind of general point here being that these anxiolytic drugs are often having an effect on our brain through facilitating inhibitory signaling between neurons. And they're doing this by interacting with the GABA receptors in our brain. And this increase in inhibition in the brain seems to have this effect of reducing experiences of anxiety. Okay, so we can finish up with a couple of poll everywhere questions. This first question is about the amygdala. The question here is, what behavior change has been observed in rats following localized damage to the amygdala? An increased fear of predators, a general blunting of all emotions, calmness in the presence of threats, or impaired memory recall? Okay, so everyone's putting option C, which is correct. So the sort of general point that this question is trying to get at is how experience of different emotions, different emotional reactions, fear, sadness, and so on, are mediated by different neural circuits in our brain, that the amygdala has this somewhat specific role in producing kind of fear responses, for example, in the presence of threats. So loss of the amygdala can interact directly or specifically with that kind of emotional response rather than necessarily causing a general blunting of emotions. One more question. So this is about benzodiazepines and how they interact with our brain. So in what way is the transmembrane voltage of a postsynaptic cell likely to change when benzodiazepine molecules are binding to its GABA receptors? Would the cell depolarize? Would it hyperpolarize? Will there be no change unless the GABA neurotransmitter is also present? Or do you think it would have some other type of effect on the cell? Okay, so the class is a little bit more split between the first three options, particularly B and C. The most correct answer here is meant to be C. So in general, when these GABA receptors are activated and they open, they allow these negatively charged ions to enter the postsynaptic cell, which has the effect of hyperpolarizing the postsynaptic cell. So that's why B is more correct than A. C is the most technically correct. As I sort of mentioned briefly then, the effect of benzodiazepines is not to open the receptor directly, but rather some drugs, including benzodiazepines, when they bind to a receptor, they don't necessarily activate it directly. Rather, they can change the configuration of the receptor that makes it more sensitive to its kind of natural neurotransmitter, in this case GABA. And so what these drugs are doing is changing these receptors in a way that means that when GABA is released naturally, it has an increased response on the postsynaptic cell. So that's why C is a bit more kind of technically correct than B. Okay, so any questions before we finish up? Okay, so next week is a long weekend. So Tuesday is NUS Wellbeing Day, so we have no lecture next week. Hope you enjoy your weekend. And yeah, I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.